Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the launch of PAS 2080-2023, Carbon Management in Buildings. And if we can go back, please, thank you. Carbon Management in Buildings and Infrastructure, and the guidance document for PAS 2080. Now, we've had a huge amount of interest in the webinar this afternoon, and attendees are still arriving, but I will move on slowly and go through some housekeeping and introduce myself and go through the agenda while people are arriving. So I'm Claire Price. I'm sector lead in the built environment team here at BSI. I've been involved with PAS 2080 since the publication of the first iteration back in 2016. And since 2018, I have been working with the Green Construction Board Infrastructure Working Group to understand user experience of the document and to engage in a lot of discussion really about the next steps for the document, whether it needed to be revised, how that might look, what we wanted to do with the document, whether to take it to ISO, whether to revise it as the PAS, and how to bring it in line with current practice, and so on. So this project began back in May 2021. So it's great to see it published today, alongside the guidance document as well. So a little bit of housekeeping as the numbers continue to climb. I'm just seeing we're up to almost 600 attendees now. So it is a listen-only webinar. We are recording it. We're very keen to have questions, so please do submit them via the Q&A function. We have left a lot of time for questions at the end, a good half an hour, 40 minutes for questions at the end. So please do submit your questions. Just click on the Q&A button in the side panel, put your question there. We've had a lot of questions ahead of time. So we will address some of those as well, but you'll be able to put your questions in the Q&A field, and we'll pick those up at the end of the webinar. You can also use the Q&A function if you're having any technical difficulties. We will be sending a feedback survey as usual at the end of the webinar, and we'll be sending a link out of the recording as well to all of you who've attended today, so you'll be sent that. And if you do want this recognised in your CPD, then please put that request in when you fill out the survey. Okay, so let's go on to the agenda. We've got a really good agenda for you this afternoon. We're going to have a welcome, an initial welcome from Anthony Bird. He's the Associate Director, Head of Built Environment here at BSI. We have some opening remarks as well from Chris Newsom, who's the Chair of the Green Construction Board Infrastructure Working Group that initiated the original standard of PAS 2080 that was published in 2016, and this one too. We have had a number of sponsors involved in this version, and Rachel Skinner, Executive Director of WSP, will be speaking on behalf of the sponsors that have contributed to this revision. Rachel is Executive Director of WSP and was ICE President in 2020-2021. So we have sponsorship nominally from Green Construction Board Infrastructure Working Group and ICE, but beneath that there's a range of sponsors that have very kindly contributed as well. Then we'll move on to the technical part of the session. We'll hear from the two technical authors, Maria Manidaki and Helene Pantelidou. Maria is Global Technical Lead for Net Zero at Mott MacDonald, and Helene is Infrastructure Decarbonisation Lead at Arup in London. Then we move on to the guidance document, and we're including a worked example in that section. And Adrian Johnson will be delivering that for us. Adrian is Technical Director of Net Zero and Sustainability at Stantec, and he has been Chair of the Technical Advisory Group for PAS 2080. So we had a separate group which looked at the guidance document and ensured that the PAS 2080 work and the guidance document work together. So he was Chair of that coordinating group. And then we'll move on to the questions to the panel. As I've said, we've got a fair few questions, so please do submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll be closing at 3 o'clock. Okay, so I'm going to pass over now to hand over to Ant Bird, and then we'll hear from Chris and from Rachel before we move on to the middle section. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our BSI Built Environment webinar, where we'll be exploring the latest revision of PAS 2080 and its new supporting guide. For those of us that haven't met before, my name is Ant Bird, and I'm Head of Built Environment Sector here in BSI. As Claire has already commented upon, today marks a great day in which we see the launch of this major revision of PAS 2080 and the supporting guide. A standard in the form of 2080 that we at BSI, in our role as the UK's national standards body, is extremely proud to have overseen and today publish. The evidence is pretty stark. The built environment contributes around 40% of the UK's total carbon emissions, and that increases considerably when one considers the variety of infrastructure installations that also exist and their related emissions. Quite simply, we need to act. The built environment sector is a major part of the problem when one considers carbon emissions, and therefore it is incumbent upon us to come forward with consensus-based sector solutions. For this reason alone, BSI continues to place a huge focus upon standards and guidance to help facilitate the built environment sector's journey to net zero. This has led to the development of national, regional, and international standards with a focus on construction works, products and materials, building efficiency, and of course infrastructure. Of late, we led the work on the ISO International Workshop Agreement number 42, in which we developed the guiding principles for net zero, and led the piece of work looking at the ISO London Declaration, which will see the active consideration of climate science and associated transitions in the development of all new and revised international standards and publications. And we'll be looking closely at our own national content as well. A key component in this body of activity has of course been PAS 2080. The first iteration was published in 2016, the world's first carbon management standard for infrastructure. The importance of this standard should not be lost on anyone, nationally or internationally. I probably shouldn't admit this, given we are here to talk about reducing our collective carbon emissions, but as part of my role at BSI, I do at times get to travel around the globe. No matter where I land in the world to attend built environment events or to meet our stakeholders, they typically want to talk about two things: all things digital, building information modeling, digital twins, and of course, PAS 2080. I kid you not. In fact, you know when an upcoming standard has truly landed when it gets discussed by the World Economic Forum in Davos, as we saw reported earlier this year in the case of the new PAS 2080 that we're here to discuss today. This is why this latest revision of the PAS, which now also includes the carbon management of buildings, is so important. This standard demonstrates how to integrate carbon management into decision making from the earliest origins of a project through to the end of life. It's specifically designed to support organisations with reviewing their carbon emissions by encouraging early collaboration between project parties. This involves setting out clear roles and responsibilities to maintain a low carbon focus throughout. Such is the importance of this standard and the ongoing national and international interest, BSI will now explore how best we can elevate PAS 2080-2023 into ISO, where hopefully one day a version can be developed as a formal international standard that we can all cite. Next slide, please, Andrew. All I have left to say on behalf of BSI is thank you. Thank you to our overarching co-sponsors of the PAS, the Green Construction Board and the Institution of Civil Engineers. In addition, my thanks go to all those that provided their collective financial support that has ensured the timely production of such an important standard and for it to be offered free of charge to the marketplace. You're all named there on the slide before you, so thank you. Our thanks also goes to those technical experts who have developed this standard, the supporting steering group members who have overseen it, and all of those within the industry that took the time to comment upon the developing standard. Finally, I want to thank all of you who have joined us today for this webinar, all 736 of you. From here on in, this is your standard for you to use. Whether you're a client, a financier, a designer, a contractor, a consultant, product manufacturer, asset manager, or a testing and certification body, to name but a few, it's now over to you. I truly look forward to seeing the positive impact that this standard will have on accelerating the reduction of carbon emissions in the built environment sector, ultimately bringing benefits to our society. Right, that's quite enough of me. It's time to hear from our all-important co-sponsors of PAS 2080, and thereafter the technical authors that have developed the revised PAS and its new supporting guide. I would now like to hand over to Chris Newsom, Chair of the CLC Green Construction Board Infrastructure Working Group. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Ant, and good afternoon all. Incredible numbers of attendees. I'm looking at 742 at the moment, but potentially I understand 1,415 registrants. So that's quite indicative, I think, of the level of interest that there is in the publication of this revised PAS. As Ant has said, my name's Chris Newsom, and amongst other things, I was a founding member of the government's Green Construction Board back in 2012, and I've had the pleasure of chairing its infrastructure working group ever since. The GCB is co-sponsor, along with ICE, of the revised PAS, and was the initiating body behind the original PAS 2080. The original PAS was launched in 2016, and it was in itself quite a remarkable document and still stands as a global first in providing a framework for managing carbon in infrastructure. It recognised the importance of leadership and collaboration across the full value chain against its strapline of reduced carbon, reduced cost. Since then, we have been seeing some of the largest infrastructure organisations gaining verification and using PAS to reduce their carbon emissions. As late as November, National Highways was the latest large organisation to gain verification against the original PAS. And notwithstanding that, the scale and urgency of carbon reduction within infrastructure and buildings has not been at the pace required against a backdrop of the climate crisis. We need to move from actions targeting carbon reduction in the individual asset to actions targeting net zero outcomes at the systems level across the entire built environment. The revisions to PAS 2080 should be viewed in this context and have been requested by many of the large infrastructure organisations. And as an aside, unlike in 2016, when we did have to go around twisting a few arms to get the original funding together, we have not had to do this time round, and that, coupled with the interest in this webinar, I think speaks volumes. So as a consequence, the revised PAS 2080 has recognised the importance of integrating the carbon framework to include infrastructure and buildings, reflecting their clear interdependencies and it takes a systems view connecting individual assets to networks that they operate within. Equally important in this revision is the new emphasis on ensuring that climate and environmental resilience are considered as part of the carbon management and decision-making process. This should provide consistency in language, behaviours and actions we collectively take when making critical decisions on how best to reduce whole life carbon when planning for projects and programmes of work that will both meet the needs of end users, the climate resilience and bring benefit to natural environment. In addition, the revised PAS and guidance document has been subject to and taken into account one of the largest consultation responses to a PAS by a BSI, and also feedback from stakeholder groups from both buildings and infrastructure community. The result is an inclusive guide, simplified, so that it is as relevant to organisations starting their journey as it is to those on a more mature pathway to net zero. Over a good number of years, I've witnessed many examples of low carbon solutions being implemented. These never happen by chance, but they happen by a proven process that the technical authoring team have detailed with a clear and structured approach, and something for which they should be congratulated. A very big thank you from me to the dedication and skill of the technical authoring team and all those who have contributed to this, and we're about to hear so much more from them. And that's enough from me because we're all here to hear the technical authoring team. But before then, over to Rachel Skinner, past president of the IC and chair of the ICG Infrastructure Client Group. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks also to all of you. You're going to get a lot of thank yous. So for all of you making the time to join in, it's funny, the number just keeps on climbing up that we can all see, which is fantastic. So we're over 750 now listening, which is fantastic. So my role today is just to offer a few words in a few short minutes. As you just heard, I'm blocking you from hearing from the technical authors here. Just a few words on behalf of all of the sponsors who've come together to make this 2023 revision to PAS 2080 possible, because it obviously, without this support and sponsorship, we wouldn't actually have a new standard to kind of discuss and celebrate and so on today. You saw the slide just now, I think, which showed all of the industry and government sponsors who've chipped in essentially in terms of getting across the cost of producing this update. So actually, first of all, from me as well, a very, very sincere thank you to everybody for supporting this. I do think actually, Chris, there was a little bit of arm twisting involved in places, but we did get there, and I think we should feel really proud of that. So thank you once again to everybody who's been part of that. So I guess just to kind of make sure that we're all clear who those actually are: Anglian Water, Arcadis, Arup, Atkins, I think that gets us out of the A's. Bays, obviously now technically a D because it's become the Department for Energy and Net Zero and DSIT. CARES on reinforcing steels, also Costain, Department for Transport Environment Agency, the ICE, Infrastructure and Projects Authority, Jacobs, Mott MacDonald, National Highways, Stantec, and appearing as it always does at the tail end of lists like this, WSP as well, which is all fantastic. In terms of that level of support, because actually it gives me great confidence that we're now going to go somewhere in terms of really applying this new standard in a far more widespread way. I just thought it was worth taking a few moments, literally just a few, just to reflect actually from my point of view on how far we've really come over the past few years. So just ahead of the beginning of my year as ICE president, which was sort of, I guess it was the middle roughly of 2020, we stood up an initiative called the Carbon Project that's now essentially evolved into the ICE's Decarbonisation Advisory Board, also links very closely with other of its advisory boards on resilience, energy, low carbon and so on. And it's kind of scary to realise that's now essentially, 2.5 years ago. But even then we knew very early on that an update to PAS 2080 was going to be one of the key points of change that would really help teams across our industry, so that's clients, consultants, contractors, everybody else in the supply chain, to really answer the key questions about, first of all, where is the carbon? And secondly, what's the thought process I need to follow in order to minimise the carbon impact or maximise the benefits I can get to through whatever the project or advice is that we're trying to deliver or consider. And I think my observation there is it's not so much that the questions were new even at that time. It was just about figuring out how to bring this into the mainstream of everyday business practice across the built environment. So really importantly, the infrastructure sectors and also buildings. So the whole of the built environment as properly defined. And you kind of roll forward those couple of years and here we are, which is amazing, frankly, to see, because on the one hand, it does feel like it's taken a bit of time. On the other hand, we have actually, you know, got to this milestone here. So you just heard from Chris, obviously on behalf of the GCB, but from me, and I guess borrowing back my ICE presidential hat just for a moment, I can say without any hesitation that the ICE is really, really pleased and proud to have led the sponsorship of this update to PAS 2080. And it did obviously take effort to gather up that funding, but the fact that it has come together just shows the importance of this standard to organisations all over the civil engineering space, and hopefully goes without saying, far beyond the UK as well, because many of the businesses that are supporting here are organisations with an international footprint. I guess for me, this update really matters and is genuinely important because it will encourage the technical behaviour change we need if we are genuinely going to play our part in reducing all of these greenhouse gas emissions. I know we're all using carbon as a kind of a shorthand here, but we actually mean all of these greenhouse gas emissions that are out there and that we need to get across in terms of the built environment as a whole. And the broadened scope, as you've already heard, to include buildings is really, really critical in this, because actually bringing all of this together under a single standard to cover all of the sectors that cover the built environment will mean that we can all speak with one voice, we can all follow the same guidance, we can all speak the same language, which is really, really important. As you've already heard from Chris, the fact that this new update brings in thinking around systems, around climate resilience, obviously the flip side of the climate action coin, in addition to the pieces to do with decarbonisation towards net zero, the pieces to do with biodiversity, circular economy, and so on, just helping people to figure out how do all these really, really complex concepts actually fit together, and what does it mean in terms of everybody's day jobs? That to me is really, really essential. And it also starts to tackle the really thorny issues around carbon when it comes to procurement and decision making, taking us hopefully from a place where we all know we should be giving these carbon impacts the respect I suppose they deserve, but actually taking us to a place where everybody has the ability to think for themselves and to have that practical guidance about how to get it more right. Now, as you've already heard, to me, one of the really, really important wins here is the fact that we will now, from a BSI point of view, and also through ICE channels, and indeed all the other channels open to us, we will be able to offer PAS 2080 to everybody without it sitting behind a paywall. So essentially it is free for everybody to access. And that of course removes a really important blocker or barrier in terms of some organisations that might have wanted to engage before now, but simply didn't feel that it was an investment they were necessarily willing to make. So I think in terms of practical application and moving towards more and more organisations becoming properly verified against PAS 2080, we should start to see that beginning to flow much, much faster now. You've already heard, and you'll hear more from Adrian in a little bit, there is also a shiny new guidance document that goes alongside the actual, the formal PAS 2080 revision itself. So that's got all sorts of things. It'll be hosted on the ICE's website, but it contains all of the case study material work, the examples. It's meant to be a pretty comprehensive guide to help people to kind of figure out that piece around, you know, what is theirs to do, what is ours to do, what is mine to do, and so on. So I think, I mean, really, I suppose I would close by echoing a point that you heard just now, I guess from Ant and then from Claire, and to some extent also from Chris. This is the point where we have to now make a choice as practitioners of all varieties across our industry and across our different sectors. I guess from my point of view, we can either leave this brand new PAS 2080 this brand new standard to gather digital dust, or we can dig into it and start to apply its principles and really seek to encourage its application in practice and bring it to life. And I think for me, it's fairly obvious which side of that fence we should fall on, but I think it is now absolutely up to all of us in terms of taking that responsibility and figuring that out. Obviously today is just the start of the learning curve. There are all sorts of other industry events coming up beyond this one as well, so do make sure you look out for those. I know, and these are just examples, I know the ICE is hosting a couple of events. I think the 18th of April is a particularly busy day for PAS 2080, so there's an event to do with PAS 2080 that day. There's another event to do with the ICE's Carbon Champions, another thing that kicked off during my year as ICE president. I think there's also another event happening that day as well, or across the 18th and 19th of April, the Interchange Transport Conference and TIP Live, where I know there are also links and sessions scheduled in terms of PAS 2080. Beyond that, there are BSI events, 18th of May, I think also the 24th of May. I think we'll see more details about that in a while. So all sorts of things coming up. So hopefully we can create a situation here where almost you can't miss this information, if that makes sense, no matter who you are and what your role is and so on. As and when people engage with these different events, they will find that the information is just being absorbed as they go through. So I think that's probably more than enough for me. So I guess the overriding message here is again one of thanks for everybody's support and for leaning into this. And now it is very much up to all of us to figure out how we get out there and get it applied as fast and as well in terms of quality as we possibly can. So I'm going to hand back to Claire now, who I think is going to take us into the core of the event. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Chris and Ant as well. Rachel and Chris will be joining the Q&A panel at the end of the overall webinar. So do put some questions in the chat box, in the question box, and we'll pick them up at the end. So yeah, so now it's time to move on to the main event, the two main events really, to look at gain an overview of the new version of the PAS 2080 and of the guidance document as well. So I will hand you straight over to Helene and Maria, and then on to Adrian to do that for us. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Chris, Rachel, and for all your introductions and the so important setting the context and the scene of what preceded the launch of PAS 2080. So I'm Helene Pantelidou, and I think I can say before we start, on behalf of the technical author team, that these last 2 years have been fascinating, a great learning for all of us. So Maria and I will be presenting an overview of the PAS 2080 and the revised content of it, but we are part of a core technical author team with over 10 people from both Arup and MOTS, as well as many other colleagues that have contributed to get us to this point. So I should also say that everyone got into this update with great enthusiasm and ambition. And they kept it all the way through, but also some pragmatism. So managing some unprecedented response from the industry and ensuring that we accommodate all 750 plus comments and opinions we got in consultation for the PAS in a workable standard was no mean feat. So I'm proud to be part of this team, and I think we got something useful out, and I enjoyed personally every moment of it. So I'd like to move on to the main content. Next slide, please. So we had, and some of this has already been mentioned, and Chris has taken us through the history, what happened before this PAS. But just to recap, we had the first legally binding Climate Change Act in the UK in 2008, and then followed by the publication of the Infrastructure Carbon Review by the Treasury in 2013, affirming the need to reduce the significant carbon impact from infrastructure and the built environment. In response to its recommendation for a common language and consistency that Chris already mentioned, BSI published the first ever publicly available specification on carbon management, PAS 2080, back in 2016. And that followed soon after the COP21 Paris Agreement, where the world agreed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Since then, the national and international political and legal landscape have changed significantly. With the example of the UK updating the Climate Change Act in 2019 to a net zero carbon target by 2050. And only last month, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change delivered their starkest warning yet, that within a decade, the world is likely to miss its goal of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees. Yet we're making slow progress in the built environment. We've already heard that a few times. In 2021, the Green Construction Board's the 7-year-on decarbonisation review concluded that although some good examples of carbon reduction exist, we're not moving fast enough. We need to accelerate our efforts if we are to realise the net zero carbon ambition. And this has triggered the substantial update of the PAS 2080, which we're finally launching today. Can I have the next slide, please? A little bit more context. And the urgency for managing to reduce carbon is evident. The example of the UK decarbonisation progress to date and its required reduction trajectory to 2050 illustrate the scale of the challenge. All sectors of the UK economy cumulatively have to drop to nearly zero by 2050, even though big impact sectors like surface transport and construction have remained stubbornly highly carbon emitting since the 1990s, despite technological improvements and increasingly stringent policy. There is only 7,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent remaining that we can spend across the economy before reaching net zero in 2050. And that does not account for the carbon of the things consumed in the UK that are produced outside its territory. In the UK and all developed countries, most of the built environment that society needs is already built, and a lot of high carbon behaviours are currently locked in the way we operate and use our existing buildings and infrastructure systems. These behaviours are eating into the ever-diminishing national carbon budgets of the net zero transition. Part of the remaining budgets should be invested towards retrofitting carbon efficiency into these built environment systems, but also increase their climate resilience to be fit for a net zero carbon future in a changing climate. Next slide, please. So the original PAS has been well used and loved. We now need to accelerate the ambition and implement outcomes for decarbonisation. The aim of the standard is, as always, to manage whole life carbon reduction within a consistent framework for carbon, both in the control and influence of the value chain. The updated standard is centered around the need for integrated carbon into decision making at every stage, rather than being a parallel environmental assurance exercise of a project or program of works that are being delivered. The lessons we learned from the 7 years on review have become the new themes of the update. First of all, breaking these industry silos and looking holistically to manage carbon across both buildings and infrastructure as part of the same built environment systems. Recognizing the need for transition to net zero carbon economy, but also clarifying that net zero is a systems level target and hence avoids the confusion from a multitude of net zero definitions that sometimes confuse us. There is even more emphasis on the need to consider whole life carbon and the implications of capital carbon investment in an asset on the operation and use of the system of which it is part. The PAS also puts emphasis on prioritizing nature-based solutions and integrating climate resilience and the associated carbon in the carbon management considerations. Finally, but definitely not least, there is even more emphasis on the importance for collaboration across the value chain to implement meaningful decarbonization. Next slide, please. So this is the list. The normative clause structure of the original PAS 2080 remains largely the same in the update, although the highlighted clauses have been substantially remodeled to reflect the changes I mentioned. So the rapidly changing policy context and need for alignment with net zero are set out in the introduction, which is also outlining the importance of addressing decarbonization of both buildings and infrastructure as an integral part of the built environment system. Clause 4 has been rewritten to outline the requirements of the decarbonization principles. More of this you will hear later. The leadership clause 5 is updated and clause 6 is rewritten with emphasis on the requirements of all value chain for integrating carbon management in decision making. Clause 7 has also been overhauled to embrace a quantification approach that is now common to both buildings and infrastructure projects and compatible with the different existing international standards on life cycle assessments. The new clause 7 is aligned with the modules table of the original PAS, but also provides greater clarity and accommodates that systems thinking approach to carbon and the control and influence that we've already mentioned for the value chain that no other standard currently addresses. Finally, clause 10 on procurement is a brand new clause, and so is the informative Annex C, which provides non-normative guidance on the important role of government, regulators, and finance in enabling meaningful decarbonization. Next slide, please. We recognize that many industry players may be unfamiliar with the systems thinking for impactful carbon reduction. So we borrowed the concept of a nesting hierarchy of assets within networks, within systems from the construction value toolkit and used it to highlight the important linkages between components and the decarbonization opportunities at their interfaces. As an example, a bridge is an asset that is an essential component of the road and associated road network to operate and be used. And the network is in turn an integral part of the regional transport network. Key to this is that different members of the value chain can control carbon at different levels, with designers, constructors, and suppliers only in control of the carbon in the construction of the asset. In contrast, asset owners control the network of their asset portfolio and can influence the systems of which they are part, which are, again, controlled by the government and regulators and its financiers. Importantly, engagement and collaboration in all directions is necessary to influence at network and system level and meaningfully manage carbon. This PAS reiterates the complexity of the value chain and the need to break our traditional silos. Also, this reference to assets very much applies equally to both buildings and infrastructure, with asset owners being the organizations that are responsible for providing, operating and maintaining buildings and infrastructure networks. In this context, buildings are asset parts of complex urban systems. Adrian will mention later the guidance example of the building retrofit at scale, which also results in the doubling of the electricity demand and hence the need for more capital carbon investment for its decarbonized generation. We're hoping that this nesting relationship should be a helpful visualization when thinking about setting out baselines, targets for projects and programs of work, and identifying the carbon that is both in the control and the influence of our supply value chain. Next slide, please. So this is the PAS on a page infographic that illustrates the whole carbon management process. So we have evolved the original PAS schematic to emphasize the iterative nature of the process of assessment, reporting, and continual improvement at every stage of the project development. The continuous iteration is centered around the importance of integration of carbon in the decision-making process, with the appropriate governance in place that encourages the realization of carbon opportunities through innovation and challenging the traditional approaches to project delivery. At the front of the management process is the need for leadership and setting ambitious targets that are compatible with a net zero transition of the system. And the carbon management outcomes are driven by the 4 decarbonization principles. Next slide, please. And the normative references to these 4 decarbonization principles are the subject of clause 4, which has substantially changed from the original. The importance of managing whole life carbon both under the control and within the influence of every member of the value chain, the need to align with the net zero carbon transition of the entire system of which it is part, prioritizing actions following the carbon reduction hierarchy, and adopting a governance that is appropriate to make generation and implementation of carbon opportunities happen. Next slide, please. I'm passing on to Maria at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleni. Hi, everyone. I'm Maria, member of the technical author team. So this is a deeper dive on one of the decarbonization principles that Eleni mentioned about managing whole life carbon. And essentially, we have developed a new whole life carbon framework that focuses on decision making. That's the keyword, decision making. You can see this in this slide in figure 4 in the PAS. The whole point of this framework is to help practitioners understand how to go about assessing and managing whole life carbon emissions at the asset, network, and systems level that Eleni introduced us to. So as you can see, we have framed those whole life emissions in a way that is compatible to existing LCA standards. We can debate that a bit more in the Q&A if you want. We did have to step away from the modules diagrams that people are familiar with in the 2016 revisions. However, these are found in existing LCA standards, this framework. We also had to compensate for the fact that none of the existing LCA standards makes reference to emissions at the system level, especially when it comes to managing whole life carbon at that level. This framework for decision making ensures that our practitioners in any value chain member can assess and manage all emission sources, a capital operational user, again, terminology we can discuss more in the Q&A between buildings and infrastructure. And these emissions are to do with emissions they can directly control, but also emissions they can show how they can influence, basically. And the way the framework presents that is that the practitioners need to look for opportunities in decarbonization within the project boundary on the left-hand side and beyond the project boundary. This is to reflect Module D and this approach in the existing LCA standards. As an example, when there is a project that is being constructed, a linear asset, for example, there could be emissions outside the project boundary from the land disturbance, or there could be opportunities to reduce the carbon in the wider system by, for example, exporting waste resources such as heat, renewable energy, hydrogen, and so on. Next slide, please. So this decarbonization principle is about the carbon reduction hierarchy, and most of you will know from the 2016 version, and the good news is that it's still there. As we all know, the greatest ability to influence whole life carbon reduction is at the need stage, and so it is very important to start early in the process. We all know that already in the current version as well. So in the update, you will see a few small differences. We have adopted a more linear language in the hierarchy. We're using terms of avoid, switch, and improve instead of build nothing, less, clever, efficiently, that maybe most of you are familiar with. Same concepts, but different language to ensure that all the practitioners know it is not only about building or not building things and focusing on capital carbon, it is about whole life carbon reductions. So as an example, avoid means, again, like build nothing, build less, really questioning the need to build or operate a new asset if it's not compatible at the system level with a net zero transition. Switching is about how do we swap alternative kind of materials with alternative fuels and renewable energy technologies or other solutions to make sure we reduce whole life carbon. And improve is about focusing on solutions that improve really resource efficiency, such as circular economy principles, efficient construction methods, and so on. So the carbon reduction hierarchy needs to be considered in every stage of the delivery process, not only, for example, the avoid being considered only at the need stage and so on. And the PAS makes this a little bit more explicit this time. Next slide, please. Another important decarbonization principle is to do with alignment to net zero transition. This can be a very complicated topic, and the PAS is trying to, if you like, articulate this principle in the context of delivering projects and programs of work. In this slide, for example, we give you an example of how this principle can be applied to targets and baselines mainly, although it can apply to all sorts of other aspects that the PAS mentions for decision making. For example, when setting a carbon reduction target at the asset or network level, an asset owner or manager would need to check whether this target is compatible with a wider system target, and one would expect in a system, could be a system or a system of systems, could be a geographical region, or for example, the transport sector, the water sector, that they would have a net zero target. Although we do appreciate and we do understand that in the current industry that we operate in, this is not always the case, and that many asset owners set net zero targets at the asset level. So, for example, we've heard what is a target net zero road or a net zero building. This is okay, it's great. However, it could have unintended consequences for the decarbonization of the wider system and may move the focus away from real life carbon reductions of individual projects at the asset or network level by focusing on removals or offsets. Again, the PAS provides a little bit more clarity and guidance of what to do in this situation, but encouraging essentially people to focus on net zero language at the system level and individual carbon reduction targets at the asset and network level. This principle also applies to baselines. A baseline will need to have the same assessment approach with methods that assess essentially carbon downstream of the process as the project develops, so that one can compare apples with apples. Yeah, clause 8 in the PAS and the guidance document provide more detail of those practicalities for targets and baselines. Next slide, please. Clause 6. So clause 6 is where the PAS 2080 carbon management process is presented in more detail, the one that a diagram that Eleni showed us earlier, the PAS in one page. So we would like to think of clause 6 as being the full PAS in one clause, not one page only, but one clause. Essentially, we had to shift the thinking on how PAS 2080 was being interpreted previously by many organizations. We've heard things of being the verification being a a box ticking exercise, and we wanted to move away from that. And so we rewrote completely clause 6 to emphasize how to actually implement the past clauses during delivery of projects or programs of work. So clause 6 is all about how all value chain members can work together when delivering projects. It provides more clarity on who needs to do what and at which stage of the process, and all the requirements which we cannot possibly fit in this webinar. Encourage, challenge, innovation, collaboration by working together in a particular project or program of work. So the focus of clause 6 is through a project lens of delivery. And you see here in the boxes in this slide some of the benefits that clause 6 brings to our thinking in delivery mode. For example, when is assessment accuracy important, the delivery process, how to consider nature-based solutions, climate resilience in the project as part of a co-benefits or trade-off space, what are the important systems dependencies, etc., how to identify the carbon under the control and influence. Adrian, of course, will give us a bit more detail of the relevant responsibilities in the guidance document. But yeah, just want to message here that clause 6 is all about how to deliver. If we go to the next slide, please. Right, so clause 7, assessment principles. So as Eleni mentioned, we swapped quantification words with assessment principles words in this revision. It has been slimmed down quite a lot with more supporting information in annexes and the guidance document. Clause 7 is appropriate for assessing whole life carbon in both buildings and infrastructure. That's quite important, and focuses on important principles one needs to consider during the assessment of whole life carbon emissions and removals as well, such as the dilemma of accuracy and data availability, which you can also see in this figure 7. For example, accepting that we need to make important decisions early without a lot of data, and how do we go about doing this without ignoring existing LCA standards and methodologies. Clause 7, as I mentioned, is all about decision making, assessment for decision making, and requires practitioners to also use the whole life carbon framework for decision making I mentioned earlier, where we have the focus within and beyond the project boundary for emissions we can control and influence. More detail, of course, is found on Annex A, and Adrian will also mention some of the worked examples that the TA team have put forward for assessment. If we go to the next slide, please. Right, clause 10, procurement. So one of the big changes in this revision is the inclusion of a procurement clause. This clause focuses on how to best incorporate whole life decarbonization into procurement processes, and it should be a big help for driving more of a step change in low carbon outcomes, because we saw, as Eleni mentioned, procurement was quite a big gap when it comes to decarbonization in the industry in the past 7 or 10 years, I would say. This new clause provides guidance on how to promote collaborative behaviors and healthy challenge in the procurement process, but also how to assist value chain players when selecting in tenders suppliers of choice, being an asset owner, being a constructor, being a designer for sub-consultants and that sort of thing. But most importantly, we have requirements in there on how to clearly communicate targets and baselines in a contract. And for this, common data and assumptions throughout the delivery process will be key. And because they will need to be included in the contract as well. Clause 10, it's important to note that is contract type agnostic. The guidance document includes further practical guidance for one forum contract, the NEC and clause X29, which has recently been published. Adrian will mention briefly, hopefully, that one of the worked examples is around that. And if we go to the next slide, please. Annex C, we don't want to go into too much detail on the annexes here, but we thought it would be important to flag this one, which is around guidance for government regulators and financiers. So Eleni mentioned earlier, in the table of contents, we have developed 3 new annexes. All these are informative annexes, meaning they don't form part of the auditive process, which we call normative, which are all the clauses. And Annex C is quite an interesting one to mention here. It is all about outlining key areas of support that we would like to see as an industry from the government, our regulators, financiers, when planning for decarbonization at the different levels, especially at the system level, where Eleni showed in the diagram that they have more direct control. So the PAS recognizes that everyone actually expects the stakeholders to drive the decarbonization agenda. And Annex C is not about actually having a government being PAS 2080 verified or accredited, but it does provide practical recommendations for all the stakeholders that are aligned to the different PAS clauses, from leadership to target setting to baseline. So as an example, setting carbon reduction targets at the system level for a government or local authority. How do they support collaborative cross-industry forums, integration in project planning at cross-sector level, etc. So we thought it would be an interesting one, and we have consulted with various stakeholders on this. And the next slide, please. So clause 2, claims of conformity. We don't want to go into too much detail on this, and I'm sure any questions you have on verification or accreditation, BSI, our colleagues from BSI can answer those. We just wanted to make a quick point now of how people are accredited or verified to PAS 2080. So clause 12 provides different the details of the different routes to verification. And the important point to remind everyone here is that as an organization, you can be verified as a PAS 2080 asset owner manager, PAS 2080 designer, PAS 2080 constructor, or PAS 2080 product material supplier. It is not that a project or a tool can be verified as PAS 2080. I mean, the reason we're mentioning this here is because we've heard mixed messages in the past and confusing messages. So we wanted to clarify that it's all about organizational verification. Verification essentially is only a consistent way to show the capability of an organization to work collaboratively with others when delivering low carbon projects and programs of work. And we do recognize that not all organizations will start from the same level of maturity. Adrian will touch on this in the guidance document, but when verified to PAS 2080, the benefits for an organization is to essentially externally demonstrate that it does aspire to gain a higher level of maturity and that it does have the right capability to start delivering low carbon. And the next slide, please, as a final one. Last but not least, we know we didn't go through the leadership clause. We want to say, again, emphasize the point that Eleni made, that the PAS revision does have a stronger leadership clause. Leadership, as Chris and Rachel and everyone said in this webinar, at all levels in an organization of the wider industry is key, has been key and will be key to face this very difficult net zero challenge we're facing, and we definitely need to act faster because we're not doing enough to get there. And yeah, I think that's it from us. I think if you move to the next slide, because I would like to pass on to Adrian Johnson, who has been the chair of our technical advisory panel and will give us an overview of the guidance document. Thank you, Adrian. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks very much, Maria and Helene. So yes, as Maria said, I had the privilege of serving as the chair of the technical advisory panel, working with the panel members, as well as the colleagues on the GCB infrastructure working group, the ICE, BSI, and of course the technical author team. And I'm just going to move on here. I think it's normal practice to convene a single steering group to develop a specification like this. However, in this case, due to the need to elicit views from across industry, we decided to instigate the technical advisory panel, reporting into the formal process. And this also helped to ensure a coordinated approach between the PAS itself and the guidance document, as you've been hearing. So we were so pleased that 32 people agreed to join the panel, and we're very grateful that they gave their time to attend 6 4-long-hour meetings to share their knowledge about what worked well in the previous version and what needs to be updated or fixed. And their inputs really helped the technical team to shape the draft documents and made it much easier to take them through the formal BSI process. And we held our first meeting in November 21, and then at key points in the process. We tackled the PAS document first, and then later helped the TA team develop the guidance document. So a huge thank you to everyone that contributed, whether in the TAP meetings themselves, the side discussions, or by written comment. I hope you like the results. So the guidance document elaborates on the whole life carbon management requirements set out in the PAS. As its subtitle says, it provides practical actions and examples to help accelerate the decarbonisation of buildings and infrastructure. And as this table highlights, the PAS specifies the PAS specifies the carbon management process and responsibilities of members of the value chain, whereas the guidance document its purpose is to elaborate on the whole life carbon management principles in the PAS and to include practical worked examples and case studies to bring these to life. In short, the guidance document is designed to help organisations wherever they are on their carbon management journey to make effective use of the PAS. So here are the contents. There are 6 sections. After the introduction in section 1, section 2 sets out the responsibilities of the value chain. Section 3 provides an overarching example called PAS City, which I'll come to in a moment. And then section 4 provides guidance on various aspects of the carbon management process set out in the PAS, supported by a range of worked examples. And section 5 sets out some key enablers and accelerators with cross references to case studies in section 6. And again, I'll mention those as we go through. So the introduction. As you expect, the introduction sets the scene. What's changed since 2016? And Elaine's talked a little bit about that. I just want to underline the fact that this is talking about not only the yawning gap between where we are on our trajectory of emissions and where we need to be, but also our duty to ensure climate resilience and to play our part in protecting ecosystems. The lessons learned from the good progress but not fast enough document highlighted a whole range of areas where we've got work to do. And recognizing that the impacts of infrastructure and buildings are often interdependent, the direction of travel underlines what Helene and Maria have been talking about in terms of extending the scope to include buildings and infrastructure. This leads on to a summary of the revisions in the PAS, as Maria and Helene have already covered. And those revisions have naturally driven changes in the guidance, including new sections on enablers and accelerators and the practical examples I've mentioned. Section 2 is about responsibilities. Every value chain member is responsible for contributing to the implementation of a PAS 2080 compliant carbon management process. As shown here, the degree of control and influence of different value chain members varies through the project lifecycle and of course from project to project. And with this in mind, the remainder of section 2 provides guidance on the responsibilities of different roles, different job roles within organizations, ranging from leadership through to strategic planners, procurement managers, asset delivery managers, designers, construction managers, material product developers, and operations managers. Guidance is given on who should take responsibility for the various parts of effective carbon management and how they might engage with other practitioners, whether inside their organization or with partners they're working with. So next we have the overarching example of what we've called PAS City in section 3. The tab really felt there was a need to provide a high-level illustration of how an effective carbon management process would work in practice to complement the other examples on more specific aspects. And the PAS City programme is the regeneration of an old industrial site located outside a city into retail, housing and office buildings. The site's been selected, but the project is at its very early stage. And the vision is for a future-proof development that fits the requirements and addresses the scope in the least carbon-intensive way and produces a capital, operational and user carbon footprint that over its life is compatible with a net zero economy. You'll see there's a summary diagram here with these various bubbles, which provides an overview, and then that's supported by some more detailed tables in this section. And together they show some of the key actions that the asset owner manager, the developer in this case, needs to initiate and manage in collaboration with others to set and progress an ambitious carbon reduction target for the development. So I've just got a few snapshots here from some of those tables. So there's a table for each work stage, starting with need. In each case, there's a column on how one might go about the task, and then the two further columns on the benefits of doing so and the potential for collaboration. So here we see nuggets of guidance on setting outcomes, providing housing and office space with their attendant utilities and transport for a certain number of people, for which their carbon objectives are defined with appropriate areas of control and influence. It is at this stage that the system and network mapping would be used to map out the various interdependencies as they are before the development takes place and how they will influence and be influenced by carbon reduction opportunities in terms of buildings, water, energy, transport, and so on. Of course, such objectives need to be reviewed with all stakeholders as the project moves through its various phases. The carbon reduction hierarchy is a common theme, as Maria has outlined, and it's in each table since PAS 2080 now requires it's applied across multiple phases of the project life cycle rather than just up front. So you see here that the carbon reduction hierarchy is mentioned multiple times. So for example, in this case, how can the defined outcome be delivered in the lowest carbon way? We may say, can we avoid carbon by repurposing repurposing existing assets, be they buildings, energy, water, telecoms, or transport infrastructure, by extending their life? Could we switch away from the new carbon emissions by recovering and reusing materials on site, incorporating them into new structures, as well as engaging with product suppliers early to explore low carbon solutions and techniques? Could we improve current practice by, for example, setting out a vision for DFMA to minimize energy materials use in the project and also encourage the use of lower carbon materials and products? So it's important for each value member to apply the carbon reduction hierarchy, even in cases where they only participate partway through the process. I've included this bubble here since this emphasizes the importance of the need to integrate climate resilience and opportunities to include nature-based solutions to reduce, replace as far as possible so-called hard assets. These might be considered for assets in this example, such as the provision of drainage, flood attenuation, wastewater treatment, and mitigating the urban heat island effect, incorporating these features into landscape design in the development. And where such measures are feasible, the benefits from the carbon avoided should be evaluated, as well as the potential for any carbon sequestration and natural chemical benefits resulting from the changes in land use. Finally, in this section, this shows the ongoing responsibility for carbon assessment and for the asset owner to work with the constructor and with suppliers to capture data at that stage, both to provide evidence of implemented carbon benefits and to inform future baselines and benchmarking of the various measures and assets deployed. There's much more we could say on this, but in the interest of time, let's move on now to section 4. So section 4 provides more detailed guidance on how to develop and implement the PAS 2080 process. It again emphasizes the pivotal role of the asset owner manager, but also that the greatest opportunity is when they work in conjunction with other value chain members. I've briefly summarized the overarching responsibilities and collaborations for applying the key clauses in the PAS here, and they're shown as in a table in the document. Remember that these labels for value chain members, such as constructor, represent functions undertaken at relevant stages. Of course, it recognizes that some organizations may undertake more than one of these functions on any given project. The summary is then followed by a series of these colored responsibility charts, which you'll recognize from the previous version of the guidance, denoting the typical responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed categories of the RAC format. These tables, which set out responsibility for key actions at each work stage, have been significantly reworked from the original guidance, very much with support from the TAP members. And in keeping with elsewhere in the PAS and the guidance, the asset owner typically has been given the more overarching responsibility, with others made accountable where appropriate. The remainder of section 4 is dedicated to a series of worked examples, 15 in all, as you can see here, covering concepts introduced or modified in the update, such as improving baselines and targets, assessing whole life emissions in buildings and infrastructure. Maria was talking about the addition of procurement, emissions from land use and carbon removals, and consideration of end of life. And they're designed to address issues that arose during the various discussions we had in developing the update. It's recognised it was important to include clarity around assessments of buildings and infrastructure, and so a worked example of these each has been included. And it was also through the discussion that more guidance was needed on target setting. And so 2 of the examples address this, one showing potential links to high-level carbon budgeting. The illustration to the right shows some steps in setting a whole life carbon baseline, including defining an outlined solution to meet a project outcome, agree an assessment method, check benchmarks, recognise uncertainties, and so on. And there's a mix of numerical examples and some more qualitative ones, and I recommend them all as really helpful advice on these various topics. Okay, so moving on to section 5, just keeping an eye on the clock here. Section 5 builds on the decarbonisation principle set out in clause 4 of the PAS. It focuses on the mechanisms that will accelerate the delivery of low carbon outcomes across the built environment, i.e. the key enablers and accelerators, without which decarbonisation will continue to be sluggish. These enablers are new concepts, so these are great ideas for future development and collective learning. Importantly, there's been lots of discussion around the need to provide more guidance to organisations to improve their maturity. Therefore, the first part of this section sets out what carbon maturity means, after which the 6 enablers are set out to help focus organisations' efforts. Woven into each of the enablers are a selection of case studies. And this is another area where the team is very grateful for the support of the members of the Technical Advisory Panel and others. And over 80 case studies were submitted from organisations across the industry. And a selection of these were included to really illustrate and amplify the 6 themes. So I just want to say a bit more on maturity. So the CLC's Good Progress But Not Fast Enough report recognise that different organisations in the value chain are at different levels of maturity. And that message came through loud and clear in preparing for the update. Carbon maturity is defined as an assessment of an organisation's level of competency in understanding and managing carbon emissions reduction. And the diagram here sets out 3 levels: foundation, embed in practice, and lead. And as organisations progress, their ability to control and influence decarbonisation increases. At the foundation level, organisations have engaged their leadership, raised awareness, and are championing carbon management amongst practitioners. They're engaging with and requesting carbon data from the value chain. They understand the importance of setting baselines and targets. They're assessing the carbon impacts of their projects and of work, and are taking action to decarbonise solutions. They're building a culture of innovation to enable low carbon solutions. Organisations at the embed and practice level have set a vision and strategy for decarbonisation aligned to the net zero transition. They understand the whole life carbon emissions of their projects and programmes. They are developing their capability for low carbon solutions and are proactively encouraging and developing innovative approaches, technologies, and products that result in whole life carbon reduction. And they're implementing a process of continual improvement. Leading organisations have truly embedded a culture of decarbonisation. It's a priority in all areas of their planning, decision making, procurement, governance, implementation. Target setting, assessment, and carbon reduction are aligned with the net zero transition. They have strong collaboration across their value chain with appropriate sharing of risk for carbon reduction, and continual improvement is evident. So I'm just going to just go through a slide on each of the enablers now. So leadership is the first of these, and leaders in all organisations should develop clear vision and strategy with defined roles and responsibilities, build capability in ways that empower people to take action, and embed carbon management in governance in ways that prioritise carbon in decision making. And the accompanying case studies provide some great examples of commitment to decarbonise without resorting to offsetting, to sharing ownership of decarbonisation through a carbon-centric approach to investment decisions, to innovative approaches that prioritising projects in the private sector so that funding supports delivery of local carbon budgets, to rolling out a suite of graded carbon training and incorporating carbon into managing project risks, and instigating a programme of organisational change to enable the transformation needed to achieve carbon reduction. The need for effective collaboration, as we've heard, is at the heart of PAS 2080. There's need for this not only at the project level, but increasingly at industry level to help drive the changes we need to see. There's some great examples of industry collaboration in the case studies, including the net zero route map for the built environment, the concrete and cement industry beyond zero roadmap and the ICE's low carbon concrete route map, and the Steel Zero project, as well as the RIBA's 2030 climate challenge with performance targets to deliver a net zero building sector by 2050. Collaboration is also vital at project level, so every value chain member can examine, challenge the scope and pursue novel ideas. Again, there's some great examples, including proactive collaboration with multiple members of the supply chain on topics ranging from progressing procurement to low carbon approaches, to pile trimming and widespread trialing of low carbon mixes, to throw out a few there. There's a whole bunch of those that you'll be interested to look at. As Helene and Maria have outlined, the need to more consistently adopt systems thinking is also at the heart of the updated PAS. And importantly, we should consider every new construction or retrofit project as a capital carbon investment to enable bigger operational and user carbon reduction across the network and system on a whole life basis. A four-step process is promoted to help organisations define outcomes within proper consideration of the wider network and system. Again, there's some great case studies where system approaches have been applied, for example, in the rail sector, in retrofitting of buildings, in flood alleviation and wastewater recovery, the latter making use of waste heat to support another industry in a circular economy approach. We've heard about the new clause on procurement, which everyone agreed was needed. And the guidance picks this up as the fourth enabler. Specifically, procurement should target and incentivize absolute whole life carbon reduction in control and influence of the value chain, establish baselines for measurement, treat carbon as an overarching obligation, not just another KPI, ensure monetary carbon values reflect the true cost of not acting, and encourage the challenge of the scope and specification. And there's two supporting case studies, one on from a public sector road project and another on power transmission, showing how carbon is already being integrated into procurement mechanisms. And Miriam mentioned the X29 climate change guidance in the NEC of supporting, being used to support that. Clearly we need more examples of this, and I'm sure we'll see that as people start picking up the new documentation. The fifth one is risk-based approaches, and this section advocates that risk-based approaches are needed that evolve traditional delivery to focus on whole life value and carbon savings, redefine risk and risk sharing to encourage innovation, and incorporate system-level approaches to better understand and manage risk and benefits better. One of the case studies focuses on adopting a novel approach to the reuse of reinforced concrete through assessing fire risk performance of existing structures. Another shows how a risk-sharing approach between a water company and the regulator through the use of a new operating techniques agreement helped enable a nature-based wetland solution with all of its attendant co-benefits in place of a more traditional one. And a third one looked at the site investigation techniques, improving those to reduce use stage carbon of assets. So the final enabler concerns the need to adopt tools and data sets that are appropriate to the granularity and level of accuracy required at the relevant stage of projects. Digital tools, of course, can ensure consistency in quantification and reporting, facilitate benchmarking and continuous improvement. All are important to an effective carbon management process. Transparency and consistency in assumptions, emission factors are important to ensure the comparison of options and against baselines are robust. We know there is a wide a variety of tools in use, some publicly available, others in-house, and these are recognised in the document. And a number of different applications of tools are included in the case studies, together with a range of examples to illustrate application across different sectors and at different stages. So, in conclusion, the updated guidance to PAS 2080-2023 sets out practical actions and examples to accelerate decarbonisation of the built environment. It provides guidance on the responsibilities of value chain members on implementing the carbon management process. It includes 15 worked examples to improve clarity on specific topics, plus an overarching PAS City example to illustrate application across selected work stages. 6 enablers and accelerators, as I've mentioned, to help organisations improve their carbon management maturity, and then a whole range of case studies showing how progress is being made in multiple sectors. So I hope you found this overview helpful. Please get hold of your copy and start using it to help accelerate decarbonisation of our built environment in your spheres of control and influence. I've thoroughly enjoyed, as everyone has, being involved in this project. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for listening today. And I'll now hand back to Claire to take us into the Q&A session.
Gosh, well, thank you all for your presentations today. That's been fantastic. There's a lot of questions coming in, a lot of fairly technical questions coming in. If you'd all like to switch your cameras on, please, and I'll make a start. Okay, so I think just to begin with, I'm thinking about drivers and you know, the achievability of these targets, thinking around net zero. Can you perhaps put the PAS in the context of those sort of challenging targets around the UK being, you know, achieving those by 2050, you know, is it realistic? And really, where does PAS 2080 fit in that? Helene, perhaps you can just highlight the role of the PAS in that context.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I think it's important, first of all, to reiterate the PAS is asking for organizations to be ready to deliver projects and programs of work in a carbon management way that is compatible with the net zero transition. So as is not about setting corporate or organizational targets and so on. So it is very much focusing on getting the setup, the tools, the expertise to deliver carbon management that is compatible at project level, that is compatible with that net zero systems. Is net zero achievable? It will take an awful lot of change of practice, and I think we need to stop talking and get doing a lot more, a lot faster, all of us. So yes, but it requires an awful lot of effort, and I'm sure the rest of the panelists have something to say on this.
Yeah, sorry to start with such a difficult one, I suppose. Yeah, did anyone else want to come in on that? Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. I'm not going to disagree with Eleni, but I think that lead organisations, as defined in Adrian's slide, those that have the maturity, will naturally start setting their own targets and will naturally start driving their own pathway towards net zero. If those lead and mature organisations happen to be asset owners, some of them under government ownership, then that will move us significantly towards the path of net zero. And of course, as a tool, PAS 2080 gives guidance on how we do that. And being a systems approach means that we're going to have to work outside our boundaries to bring others with us and make much, much better and smarter decisions as society. So it's opening this up to the right topics, the right discussions to be had, hopefully at the right level. And by that I mean mature organisations, by definition, it's landed in the C-suite. It's at the C-suite and coming down through the organisation, pervading everything that happens. So, you know, it will be in the right place to make some massive changes, how we decide things, what we decide and what we do, and as a society, what we accept. Whether or not it'll get us to net zero 2050 is the $64,000 question. I can't answer that one, but I know that there have been some amazing achievements already, and I know that with the essence that lies behind this revised PAS 2080, there will be even more amazing achievements to come.
Thank you. And really, I guess, I mean, thinking about the role that government may have to play in this, you know, what is their role? I don't know, Rachel, whether you'd like to pick this one up, the interest from government and their role both as regulator and as the biggest construction client. What role can they have in this?
Sure. I mean, I think it links really closely to what we were just hearing in response to the previous question as well. Some of the most actively engaged organisations right now around PAS 2080 are the government, yes. Arm's length bodies and various departments and so on, which I think is actually a really good indicator of the level of interest and appetite. The point around the responsibility for making change and who is able to drive certain types of change, who owns the outcome and who is helping towards those outcomes and so on, I think that fits really, really neatly in here, because for those of us who are part of the supply chain, we will very soon see that we are, shall we say, strongly encouraged to fall in line with this. And I think what this revision to PAS 2080 helps to do is it brings it sharply into focus. You know, whether you are part of the government setup already pointing at net zero 2050 and being pushed and cajoled and asked lots of difficult questions around actually how is that going, or whether you are part of, you know, a private sector organisation who's trying to help government do that, or indeed whether you are, you know, a private sector organisation acting as a client out there in the industry, you can see how these levers will start to come into play. And to some extent, the prior version of PAS 2080 was already beginning to do that, but I think this is a huge step, genuinely, in the right direction in terms of taking us to that point where actually people have no choice but to fall in line. I think it also, very briefly, pulls through a very, very useful distinction, just to go back to Helene's point, around the difference between the directly controllable, largely corporate or organizational carbon emissions, which for many are being covered through other channels, and then the impact of the thinking, the advisory work, the design work, the construction work, etc., that all of us are engaged with. They are all part of the same carbon picture, but we need to think about them differently.
Thank you, and I guess for Maria and Adrian, and probably for Helene too, actually, for the technical author team, what are the challenges for industry? You know, what are the main challenges for industry during this implementation of this new version of PAS 2080? Maria, Adrian, do you want to go first? Adrian, go ahead.
I was just going to make a brief point that, you know, as we know, various sectors across, you know, the built and buildings and infrastructure are incredibly busy and often dominated by short-term priorities, and particularly where there's a need to meet short-term regulatory needs. And I think often I see that that trumps some of this, the time we need to spend thinking about how we address decarbonisation and the related issues. So I think that's what we've got to do, is try and work out how to overcome some of that organisational industry inertia around short-term priorities and properly think about this, the longer-term impacts of what we're doing.
Maria, I mean, I guess you'd like to say more on that, but how do individuals influence their own companies?
I mean, it takes time. If you ask me, it's always about behaviors taking time, and that's why it's important to have, and what we've seen in the last few years since the first PAS, you really need to have the right voices in organizations, the right energy and the right seniority as well to open up conversations with others in the industry, your peers, your clients, the government, the regulators. But for me, reflecting on what our other colleagues here said earlier on the previous question and what Adrian just said, it's very, very important not to ignore the role of government and regulators, because in some countries, especially in the UK, for example, there is the legal ambition or legal target, but then below that, there isn't anything else that is legally binding, almost. So that means, yeah, bottom-up push and leadership is great, but without a more coordinated approach and integration at the system level, I don't think it's going to happen fast enough. So there are some policy levers that need to be pulled at the right time, I think. Of course, the PAS 20 doesn't do that, but that's why we were very keen to include an annex on some practical guidance and steps for stakeholders not relevant for the implementation of the PAS. Yeah.
Did you want to pick that up as well, Helene?
Just to add, the flip side of it is that in the last couple of years, the rate of change that we have observed amongst our organizations and others is unexpected in my view. It has taken off in a way for very many reasons, not just government requirements, legal requirements, and so on, but there is an awful lot very promising, I want to think, a change that we were not expecting. For a long time, we're saying nobody's getting, climate change is real, and so on. But all of a sudden, it's in everybody's mouth. Everybody's talking about it, and that maturity that we are trying to achieve.
Yeah, unfortunately, your sound is sort of going in and out a little bit, Helene, but we're picking up, I think most of that. Yeah. So I mean, there is a willingness in industry, and I guess I mean, take up the original 2018 was seen to be a bit patchy, and there's been a lot of encouragement around clients. But I think just moving on to SMEs, there's been quite a few questions, both in advance and today, really, about what strategies, what advice there may be on strategies that SMEs can use to take up PAS 2080. Maria, did you want to?
Yeah, SMEs, it's interesting. I would like also to hear from Adrian on this, would like and Chris, because SMEs has been one area that we really had to think hard about, because many people think the PAS it's so onerous that only a very large organization can use to follow through. Now, the advice we would give to SMEs, obviously, it's not all about the verification, accreditation, and costs associated with that. It's about two things for us. One is to really pick out the key components that will make the biggest difference of your service or product to a project or program of work. Could be having an EPD through the assessment, could be following and showing the benefits through the carbon benefits of your product or service through just simply following the decision framework, the carbon decision framework. But most importantly, it's all about trying to be more proactive to the right and knock on the door of the asset owner or the other stakeholder in the value chain that will be able to make a decision to incorporate your service that will add value. we shouldn't forget what Adrian mentioned in the guidance document about the enablers and accelerators, that when people get together at the sector level, industry level, then more powerful things happen. So we would really encourage SMEs to join forces with their peers in the sector and have a louder voice, stronger voice on this. Yeah.
So Adrian, did you want to come in on that? Or Chris? Adrian?
Chris, go ahead.
Sorry, no, that's me being bad. Yeah, so Adrian, please go ahead.
No, I was really just going to underline something that Maria had already said about reaching out, you know, where you're working, particularly if you're working perhaps in a geographical area with a particular client, and there's common, you know, there's a number of SMEs working in that area, reach out to one another and work together. And I think that's a key theme. We can't overstate it, can we? Collaboration in this space is fundamental to success.
Rachel, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, although I don't know whether Chris is now next, but I'll keep it very brief. I think the other thing that potentially we might start to see in this space, and just thinking more widely around the importance of understanding organizational carbon footprints in a more strategic sense. It is going to be in everybody's interests, no matter where they sit in the supply chain, to help those upstream of them in the supply chain to help to reduce their respective carbon impacts as well. And I think it's fair to say that we're all starting to see that effort play out, and that would absolutely benefit the smaller businesses within those supply chains as well, because actually carbon isn't like money. It's not just one person holds the money at any one time. Carbon flows through these supply chains, and everybody has a responsibility through those supply chains to try to basically get it down as fast as possible. That's the case whether you're dealing with SBTI and trying to get, you know, the relevant validation that way, or whether you're dealing with PAS 2080. I can really see how there will be quite a lot of benefit in that space as well, in terms of knowledge sharing, encouragement, support, skill building, that kind of thing. So that could be a really positive angle as well, if we all choose to lean in on that.
Chris?
Yes, thank you. As the team know, I've been a strong advocate for, right from the outset of PAS 2080, all aspects of the value chain being able to become verified or accredited to PAS 2080. Even if at the moment in time of considering that decision, the next person up the value chain perhaps wasn't thinking like that. There's great value in somebody down at an SME level, be they a plant provider or product provider or whatever, being accredited to PAS 2080 when the next person up the chain or the client decides that that's what really, really matters. They become the first people in the queue for consideration. From the SME perspective, I think that then is quite a valuable tool to go, as Maria says, knocking on doors and saying, look what I can provide, we're accredited to. But more so, coming down then from the C-suite within the SME, it gives a guide of where to innovate, where to act, where to invest, in other words, to become even more attractive to that wider value chain. So I think I see nothing but opportunity from doing this. And then at the point where we're really acting and the needs are being determined right up front, then we've got strong alignment right the way down through the value chain, right the way down to the SME to be able to deliver this. And therefore, the chance of getting to net zero sooner rather than later comes home. And I've seen some, you know, just in the short space of time that we've been talking about PAS 2080, the number of plant suppliers who've taken the choice to green their fleets, to provide green plant, to yes, those clients are asking for it, but even then the clients who aren't, we have benefited from greener fleets, from lower carbon being spent in construction because of the challenges that are around. So let's go and do it. Let's encourage.
Thank you. And I'm going to move on to some of the more technical questions shortly. But we have had an awful. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of people attending today from overseas. There's been an awful lot of questions. There were a few in advance and many today about the application and internationalisation of PAS 2080. I mean, I have heard, I understand it is used internationally. Helene, perhaps you'd like to respond to this about how applicable it is to the developing economies, as well as other economies, actually. Sorry, Helene, that's... Oh.
Yes, I hope you can hear me properly.
Okay, yes, yeah.
I'm doing my best, okay. So very applicable is the answer. So carbon management means, you know, not having quite the data or not having full details of what the carbon is and the different components shouldn't be a barrier for thinking around resource efficiency, sourcing of materials, planning, optioneering for whole life carbon emissions. Almost there is an opportunity to follow carbon management principles to leapfrog and avoid the mistakes that the developed countries have done over the years and have locked ourselves into high carbon behaviors. The challenge will be around the definition of equity on the net zero systems transition, and that is real. So we have to think about targets in a different way that we're doing in developed countries. But the principles of carbon management apply, and they are international, not something particularly special for the UK or some part of the world. And it is important that we all join in.
Rachel,
just to amplify that a little bit, I can say with some certainty that there is already international interest from other developed economies around the world in this, and I think once we take the time to go beyond saying, oh, it's past 2080, and we actually explain what it is we're talking about, it's incredible to see, you know, whether you're looking into parts of the US or Australia, New Zealand in particular, areas I'm very much aware of where they are very aware this is coming out and they are already paying attention. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we've got people online now who are from those parts of the world and are already thinking about how they apply this. So I'm aware of some people who used to joke that in some cases on net zero, people sort of followed the UK plus a couple of years. I think right now it's probably, you know, that difference in time is reducing fast, shall we say. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see that interest and appetite coming through straight away.
We also had in the technical advisory panel Tim Barry from Watercare, which is from New Zealand, which is great. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, that was great input.
Okay, so I think I'm going to just, I think this is quite a nice one to start with, actually, in terms of getting into a bit more of the detail of the documents. As this is now a new standard within the building space, do you think building developers will be willing to incorporate this thinking and also willing to pay for the extra work required to manage carbon in line with this new standard? If you'd like to pick that up. I think it ties into a broader question really about this change into, you know, the implications of the change to buildings away from, well, not away from, but including infrastructure. And there are quite a number of questions about what that might mean. You know, how do you envisage that that change and the challenges around that change? Perhaps the technical team would like to pick that one up. Maria, do you want to?
I'll make a start. Yeah, of course, Claire. So the technical author team have engaged extensively with stakeholders in buildings and infrastructure to come to a consensus in various points. We really understand one of the things that was quite interesting to appreciate is the difference in language being used between buildings and infrastructure, as well as terminologies, standards, especially on quantification, etc. So there are some cultural differences. However, in the past, we tried to really align those two. So we don't want to scare anyone off. So anyone in the buildings community, in this audience or anywhere else at the moment, please make sure you read the definitions in clause 3, and you will find your own language there if you haven't found it within the clauses. But fundamentally, for us, the biggest benefit in the buildings community and development is how to really start thinking of carbon opportunities and how a specific building, which is at the asset level, as Eleni mentioned in the inverted pyramid, how does it fit with the surrounding network and system, the infrastructure associated with that, the road network, the electricity network, the water, the wastewater. Paz City in the guidance document is attempting to do that, to really show to a developer what perhaps are the questions you need to be asking yourself and your supply chain and other stakeholders in the system. And also we have a really good and powerful worked example of buildings at development and network level, if you like, to see how different decision made for retrofit or not could impact the capacity of the energy system, for example. And these are very important points, and we think in the TA team, we're very optimistic that we think developers will really welcome this and would pass by the fact that perhaps the terms being used are not the bread and butter that they have been used to in the past. But that's it, I want to say.
If I might, Claire, just very quickly on that. I guess I'm putting on a slightly different hat just for a second. I sit on the as a sort of a non-exec director of the World Green Building Council, and I would just echo what Maria has said there. Yes, there is a different language being spoken between the buildings experts and the other infrastructure sector experts, but actually I think having this document as kind of a connector, if that makes sense, will in time mean that the language starts to align a bit more closely. There's already a ton of work going on in the building space as well across all of this. So actually a lot of it is not that different. It's not that alien. It's just a case of getting comfortable with it. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And points of clarity around the RICS professional statement. Obviously, they've just reissued that for consultation, an update on that. I don't know how they fit together and with the plan net zero building standard as well. I don't know if that's been on your radar, and I mean, I think there was some connection on RICS, TA team, I think. Perhaps Adrian, are you aware of that?
Yes, I mean we know there was there's quite a lot of discussion, as Maria was saying, through the course of the project, and certainly in the spirit of it, very much wanting to build on what each other's doing to get a real collaborative, integrated approach. I mean, for me, I think the optimistic view of this is that we will start to see multiplier effects happening here, particularly where you've got buildings and infrastructure together in proximity. I think the opportunity is for developers and infrastructure providers to get together at that level and really say, in this area, what can we really do? I mean, I saw some interesting research recently which suggested that in the housing sector alone, with government policy around new builds of housing, the amount of new housing new builds, it could consume the whole carbon budget up to 2050 that we've got for the whole country. So we really have an imperative to integrate better, so that we're not managing separate carbon budgets, but we are working together to really seeing this as one overall problem. And I think the mandate is clear on that.
Thank you. Yes, and let me just look at this one here, raise some of the ones that have come in today, which is an interesting one. I think that PAS 2080 is necessarily generic because it does cover a wide range of situations, and does the panel envisage that there may be sort of spin-off advice or the need for focusing down on specific applications in the future? or specialist guidance in the future. Is that a bit too much to take on when you've just finished this this important revision? Helene, you look like you're about to say something.
I can try.
Please do.
I go at it. Also because, you know, the amount of effort needed to put a standard, even a simple update together is staggering. So I'd suggest to stick with that spirit of come together, collaborate, and join up forces, rather than discretize and say, here's the instructions for a certain group, or this is slightly different for another one, and so on. So it has to be that the sort of decarbonization principles aren't necessarily generic, and they are in a way taken on by different skill sets, different businesses differently. But that collaborative bit, that idea of stop seeing carbon as a competitive advantage and talk about joining and collaborate and change completely your business model to address this super urgent crisis we need to solve, is a mindset change. And it doesn't take just a list of instructions that are specific to your discipline. Is changing everything and joining in. We don't know all the answers. We can't write exact specifications, but which makes it even more important to join forces and collaborate. So the answer is no separate discipline guidance.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I don't know if there's a consensus of that, because I was going to turn to you, Chris. I mean, there's one of the original initiators of 2080. If you had a view on that.
Well, the only view is that it is generic, because it cannot replace everything that's gone before, whether you're talking about one sector or working cross sectors collaboratively. So everything that's there before as methods of measurement is still there. What PAS 2080 is doing is saying, get yourself up, out the weeds, look across, decide better networked solutions, look for the opportunities that perhaps missed us, and then as we work collaboratively, if there are things missing in that new world where we're talking the same language and we're working collaboratively, that means there needs to be something further developed, it will happen, and it will happen sooner and faster and to the benefit of all, rather than doing it in the way that we've been doing it historically in silos. So, you know, never say never, and nothing is forever. This is a document that lifts us out of the weeds and makes us look at the art of what's possible going forward at a systems level. And when we do that, I think we'll be surprised, pleasantly surprised at the opportunities that we find. And maybe the cost won't be the astronomical cost that are feared in an earlier question, because we'll find opportunities and we'll find innovative methods. And where we don't, we'll find different ways of solving the issue, I am absolutely certain. So I'm just trying to answer a couple of questions there in one, but I see opportunities, and this document's at the centre of it.
Thank you. Yeah. So I am going to start to think about wrapping up, because I do need to just address the question of compliance certification against PAS 2080. We've had an awful lot of questions that have come through both in advance and online today, and I know that there's a lot of interest in that. Just for clarity, really, this is very much about the standard itself, the new document, and the requirements in it, as opposed to anything around the certification side of it. PAS 2080-2016 is withdrawn immediately. So any issues around existing certification and moving forward to being certified to 2023. That's something for those who are doing your certification. Obviously, there are a number of providers. BSI is one, but LRQA as well. And I know there's been, National Highways have been talking about some accreditation that they've gained, which is slightly confusing, but accreditation, as far as I understand it, there is no UCAS, United Kingdom accreditation, so it's accreditation of scheme owners to this standard at the moment, but people are offering the certification and verification services to it, and as far as I understand it, the changing scope of the standard and the differences to it, anybody doing verification will just rebalance their requirements as they do with every standard. In terms of training, I imagine there is quite a lot in development. BSI is developing a new learning module which will be released later this year. We are expecting to be running, my colleagues across the other side of the business are expecting to be running events around certification and verification. And I have let them know how much interest there is today on that. And I don't know if anybody else knows of any other training. I don't know if ICE or there's other training activities that anyone's aware of at the moment. No, nobody's nodding.
I think it's more awareness for now, isn't it? And then it'll probably move into the next stage, yeah.
We're literally launching today. The PAS and the guidance have not been made public at all. Nobody's seen them until today. So they are hot off the press today. So there'll be a lot of work being done by all of those peripheral organisations that take up and provide services against the standards, as well as those wanting to comply and actually take it up. So all that work really begins now, as usual. So unless there's any final words from the panel, I'll draw the questions to a close, and we'll move on to the last couple of slides. So this is where you can download the PAS and download the guidance document as well. That's not the address. Obviously, these are live links that will come through with the webinar. Is there any way, Angie, that we can actually get those other links up to the participants? If we can, that would be really helpful. There was a bit of trouble with the guidance document link this morning, and we needed the full address. So perhaps we can make sure that they get put up there. Before we sign off, I think we've got those. And then the next slide, which just outlines a couple of the events that are coming up. The really important one on the 18th of April, which is a strategy session at the ICE. I understand that the in-person event is full now, but you can still sign up to join it remotely online, so do that. As I mentioned, BSI has got a couple of events coming up quite quickly. 18th of May up at UK Digital Construction Week, where they'll be having a discussion about PAS 2080 and BIM. And there is a planned webinar on the 24th of May, which will be specifically around the verification offering, PAS 2080, how can BSI support your organisation's carbon management? So do look out for those. We haven't got links up for those two yet because they're new, but you'll be able to do a general Google search for those. And for more information, obviously, knowledge@bsigroup.com. So do download the documents, and thank you all for your questions. There were a lot of them, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I tried to keep it a bit more conversational, so I hope that worked for today, and apologies once again for not getting to all the questions. So I think that's it. I think I would like very much to thank all our panelists, Ant Bird, Chris Newsom, Rachel Skinner, Maria Manizaki, Helene Panteladou, and Adrian Johnson. Thank you so much for your time and your input. That's been really helpful and a really good session. And thank you all for tuning in. Thanks. Goodbye.